Introduction slide. 2023 Teaching and Learning Symposium. Sustaining Communities of Hope. Speaker, Kevin Gannon, Professor of History, Director of the Center for the Advancement of Faculty Excellence.
So I wrote this book on hope that came out on April 1st, 2020, which was in retrospect ironic. And feels like we've been running ever since, right? And I know for those of you who have been, navigating this transition through pandemic pedagogy to whatever this is now, which feels very uncertain and very fraught and very liminal, that hope might be a hard thing to come by. And I want to be very clear at the outset that when I talk about hope, I'm trying to get at hope in a substantial and meaningful way, not in a sort of airy and flimsy Hallmark card version of hope, right? Because all too often, I think in our discourse, we talk about hope in the sense that, and we hear this phrase a lot, right? Like, I have hope in the future. And we hear this in higher ed a lot because it's kind of a standard way of saying, I'm not completely surrendering yet, and I work at a place where at least theoretically we shape the future. But it's also kind of a dangerous place to be, because if I say too often, I have hope in the future, what I'm also sort of insinuating is that it's not my responsibility to help bring that about, maybe, right? Like, I'm taking the off ramp, because what we do when we sort of offer that vague platitude is we basically make a declaration that just because time passes, things get better. And for those of us in the room who are trained as historians, that's not how any of that works, right? And so what does it mean to work with hope and from hope in times such as these? In institutional situations or sector-wide situations that seem to militate against the very idea of even optimism, much less some sort of meaningful vision of hope. And I think we need to acknowledge that, of course, we don't exist in a bubble in higher education, right? We are part of the society that surrounds us, our students and us. We come to campus, we come into these teaching and learning spaces, trying to shape, but also being shaped by the larger socio-political, cultural context around us. And it is a context right now where we see, for example, resurgent violent white nationalism in the very halls of the Capitol in some cases. We also see worldwide the march of far-right ethno-nationalism, authoritarian movements, all of them related and in communication and contact with one another, including those within the United States. And we see that context reflected in the legislative chambers of various states. And it's easy to say, well, I don't live in Florida, but we will all be living in Florida at some point. Violence, racism, structural inequality, despair, a necrotizing society in many ways also expresses itself much more dramatically in instances as well, whether it's in the halls of higher education, in elementary schools, or the front porch of a random white citizen. Empty bookshelves testify to the reluctance of some of those in power to even begin to mention, much less grapple with, the wicked problems that plague our context. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention that this violence and this exclusionary othering that seems to be the prevalent mode of political discourse is targeting certain members of our community much more so than others. In particular, our trans folks, members of our community, who are feeling right now a particularly attenuated sense of potential violence and danger. And in institutions, we're not safe from this just because of our institutional heft. The example of the New College of Florida, with the hostile takeover of a concerted right-wing anti-higher educational campaign, proving, at least in this one context, successful. In our classrooms as well, we feel, and our students feel, the ways in which this shapes our ability to be fully present in the situations that we find ourselves in. And so if you read the Chronicle of Higher Education, these are headlines which will seem familiar to you and perhaps describe much of what we're feeling in this day-to-day scene in our classrooms. A stunning level of student disconnection. But it's not just our students, it's our colleagues as well, faculty and staff burnout, disengagement on that side as well. And finally, my favorite, because it so vividly describes the 21-22 academic year from my vantage, it feels like I'm pouring energy into a void. Other than that, things seem to be going great, right? But of course, they aren't. It's a lot. And we are, I think, at a crisis point. Now, again, as someone who's trained as a historian, I'm a little reluctant to use the word crisis because it is a word that often gets overused and we perhaps rob it of its power when we do that. The word crisis makes a great textbook chapter title, right? The crisis of blank. But if not now, when can we use this word? About a century ago, an Italian newspaper editor, activist, intellectual, and thinker, Antonio Gramsci, found himself wrestling with some of the same things that we find ourselves wrestling with today in U.S. higher education and in U.S. society. Gramsci was one of the earliest and most public opponents of the emergent fascist regime of Benito Mussolini in Italy, and as such found himself in prison as one of the earliest imprisoned opponents of Mussolini and his fascist movement. And while in prison, Gramsci wrestled as a sort of public intellectual with what had happened. How did we get here? How did we get from a place of, at least theoretically, a liberal constitutional order to this, to violent, thuggish, ethno-nationalism, fascism, where force is the rule of the day? And for Gramsci, the more urgent question even on top of that was, how did the rest of the population of this country buy into that and see that as the solution? And for Gramsci, what he concluded was that the status quo had become so unsustainable that it had lost legitimacy. And so the old order of things had passed. You know, the emperor had no clothes and everyone realized it at that point. But yet it was unclear as to what would happen next. And so for Gramsci, the crisis he found himself in, he wrote, consists precisely in the fact that the old is dying and the new cannot be born. And in this interregnum, a variety of morbid symptoms appears. Morbid. Death. Death-centric. A society where death, not life sustainment, was at the center of things. A society necrotizing before Gramsci's very eyes. The Slovenian philosopher Slavoj Zizek translates Gramsci's work a little more creatively. If you've ever read Zizek, you know that overwrought prose is kind of his brand. And Zizek writes of this passage, the old world is dying and the new world struggles to be born. Now is the time of monsters. And yes, perhaps one might argue this is overwrought, overly dramatic language. But what are historic levels of income inequality that prevent people in the community from accessing things like housing and healthcare, which should be basic human rights, if not monstrous problems? What is the resurgence of violent white supremacist ethno-nationalism, if not a monstrous problem? What is the steady gutting of higher education? One of the few institutions in our society that has the wherewithal to perhaps address solutions to these other problems, if not a monstrous problem. You are likely thinking to yourself at this particular moment that this is the shittiest talk on hope that you've ever been to. This guy sucks. Looking at the when's the panel start? Right? But there's a point to this, right? And it's not to sit in all of the problems and feel helpless, but it's just to be honest. right? If we have hope for creating a more just and more sustainable future, then we can't lie to ourselves about where we are now, right? If we're not willing to be honest with ourselves about where we currently stand, we cannot discern where it is that we need to go. If we lie to ourselves now, we are lost. And so without the ability to be unflinchingly honest, as much as it feels overwhelming and painful, it is a necessary step in actualizing hope, if we are to mean anything substantial by this idea of hope. And so how might we conceptualize hope in a way that gets us at this sustainability of hope as a practice? And I think some of the wisest words I've ever heard about this come from Mariam Kaba, a teacher and activist and writer, who has said on many occasions, hope is a discipline, right? And I think this is a particularly valuable way to think about hope, because it shows us, it has us conceive of hope not as a place at which we arrive, but as a discipline that we undertake regularly. Hope is a discipline. So what does that mean for Kaba? In an interview that she gave recently, she sort of elaborates on that concept a little bit, talking about the work that goes into it. It's work to be hopeful, she says. It's not like a fuzzy feeling. Like, you have to actually put in energy, time, and you have to be clear-eyed, right? Unflinchingly honest. What matters is to have it, to believe that it's possible to change the world. And so for Kaba, what's important is this recurring question that you see in a lot of her interviews and writings. What's the next best thing? What is the next best thing? What is the thing to do now? What is the work in front of me now? Rebecca Solnit, in her essay, Hope in the Dark, that she wrote back in 2004, talks about hope not as a lottery ticket that you hold on to feeling lucky, but as an axe that you break down doors with in an emergency. It's a commitment to a better future, Solnit writes, and Kaba says. We don't need to know exactly what that future looks like, only that it is better than where we are now. And that commitment to the future, as Solnit puts it, is what makes our present inhabitable. Anything that helps make our present more inhabitable, I think, is an inherently good thing. But that commitment to vision of the future that may be indistinct and yet is more just and sustainable, that can be enough to act in hope. And it relieves from me or from you individually the obligation to define exactly what that better, more just, more sustainable future looks like. We don't have to have all the answers to that, but we do have to help create the space in which we can cultivate it and it can grow. Hope has also been looked at in the academic disciplines. There is a robust discussion in psychology, for example, about what some of the psychologists call a hope state. In this case, the psychologists who are studying this idea are looking at, what helps people believe in a positive outcome or in the achievement of goals after a certain length of time, even if there is no evidence, no empirical data to suggest that that achievement will actually happen, right? So hope in spite of everything. And for Snyder and his colleagues who have probably dived into this question more extensively than anyone else, hope is an enduring disposition, they argue. An enduring disposition that rests on two foundations: agency and pathways. In the education and educational development communities, this idea that Snyder and his colleagues have argued has been sort of represented, and Snyder and his colleagues actually started this discussion, but represented as almost kind of a pithy mathematical equation. Hope is the sum or the working together of agency and pathways. And so think about it from a higher ed context. And I don't want to pick on any of my mathematician colleagues, but we know that one of the chief obstacles to academic success for first-year college students is mathematics. Many students come to us with a well-developed sense of math anxiety, and our colleagues in mathematics have to work really hard just to try and get past that before they could even move into the actual subject matter of their courses. So think about that student who comes to us placing into what some schools call developmental math, or that very sort of foundational level math course, and looking at not just that course, but several more that they got to get through to fulfill whatever prerequisites are there for their program. And that student comes into that math course having never succeeded at math, and has maybe been told either implicitly or explicitly by instructors in high school that maybe they're just not a math person, or people from your school really don't do well in math, or your math test scores say that this isn't the way that you think. And so that student has come into that class, in the literal sense, hopeless. They do not believe a positive outcome in that class is possible. And yet, here they are in a class dedicated to try to bring them to that positive outcome. And so for the instructor in that class to turn hopeless into hope, you have to work with the student to get them feeling both agency and pathways. So agency. Do the decisions I make, the strategies I adopt, the choices that I take, do those lead to an outcome that I can control through my own actions and decisions? Do I have that agency? But agency in and of itself isn't enough, right? Because that student is, because if we focus on agency too much, we'll say, hey, if you work really hard, you'll pass, right? Well, that student has likely been told that before and they have not passed. And if there's one thing that we've all learned about college students is they have a very finely calibrated BS detector. And once we trip that thing once, right, that conversation doesn't get anywhere. So we can't just give the same old platitudes. So the agency in and of itself isn't enough. It's the pathways that matter. And so maybe for this student, it's supplemental instruction, math lab, Khan Academy videos, peer tutoring, office hour visits with the instructor, likely some sort of buffet that brings all of those things in, right? But deploying that agency along certain pathways is what leads to a meaningful sense of hope. And so just as that example might apply to a struggling first-year student anxious about the course content, it applies to us too. What is your agency? And it can be hard to feel like you have any in an institutional context sometimes. If you're a graduate student, an early career faculty member, if you're not tenured, if your employment status is precarious or contingent, if you are classified as staff and not faculty, all of that can feel very fraught, but you do have agency. Where can that agency be deployed? One hint, the classroom. If you are an academic leader, and not just in the formal sense on the org chart, but you've been at a place for a while, you're a senior member of the department, you are in a position in college or unit level leadership, maybe your agency is to help others find theirs and to sustain them as they use it. And if need be, offer them protection and cover if they use it as well. What pathways can you deploy your agency on? What pathways should you deploy that agency on? And this part of the process is also essential, right? We have to be strategic about the resources that we use. And I know that sounds like a horribly capitalist way to frame things, but think about the most precious resources you have: time and emotional energy. They're not infinite. And so where do you deploy those things where they will have the maximum effect? And where do you avoid deploying them in situations where they will have no effect? And so maybe up to this point, you've been beating your head against the same brick wall. Maybe it's time to let that go and to go around or over or through. Where do we use that agency? Because we have no shortage of wicked problems in higher education, which is something that all of you are more than aware of, right? But again, we find ourselves at a moment where many of these wicked problems have come together in the sort of confluence from hell, testing the resources that we have both individually and institutionally. The current state of disconnection and atomization that so many of our students are feeling, and I would add parenthetically that so many of us are feeling as well, that is not sustainable. Current faculty and staff workloads, which intensified during the pandemic and threaten to continue to intensify without an expansion in the numbers of those doing the work, those are unsustainable. Current funding models for higher education are unsustainable. The current and ongoing rate of adjunctification and precarity and outsourcing, one might add, of faculty roles is unsustainable. Higher education trying to coexist with authoritarian governments is not sustainable. The reason none of these things are sustainable is because these are trends, these are things that are pushing us towards dehumanization, that are fundamentally dehumanizing processes. And so as Paulo Freire, the Brazilian writer and educator, wrote about this phenomenon of dehumanization, he said, not only affects those who are having their humanity taken from them, but it affects those who are doing the stealing as well, albeit in a different way. Nobody gets out clean. Dehumanization prevents us from fulfilling our vocation, as Freire put it, of becoming more fully human. And if you're looking for kind of an elevator pitch as to what do you do in higher ed, helping people become more fully human, you could do a lot worse. But when we dehumanize, we render people marginal. We exclude rather than include. We perpetuate rather than remedy inequity and injustice. So let me suggest two specific areas of practice that we at this moment might undertake in whatever our teaching and learning contexts happen to be. Maybe that's in a formal classroom, face-to-face on site. Maybe that's in a virtual classroom. Maybe that's a blend of both. Maybe you are involved in teaching and learning in a non-formal classroom setting. But all of you are involved in teaching and learning because this entire campus is a teaching and learning space. Our students learn in the classroom, but they learn in the financial aid office, the cafeteria, the quad, wherever. And so the question then becomes, what are we teaching if they're always learning? And so two areas that can help inform our practice. Closed captioning is obscuring my dramatic lettering, so I will read them to you. But the first is presence. How might we think about cultivating and sustaining presence? Because at its most fundamental level, education is a social endeavor. And I think we learned this lesson perhaps most urgently during pandemic pedagogy, when we lost that social aspect, right? I mean, you could say everybody's here in Zoom, but everybody's not really there in Zoom, right? I go to faculty meetings on Zoom right now, and I am sort of there, but not there, right? Presence feels more attenuated. And even in our on-site classes, in-person learning, you're probably experiencing a sense of presence that feels, if anything, vulnerable and only occasional as opposed to constant. And that's a symptom. The symptom of the effects of the larger dehumanizing processes that are at work here. So how do we return learning into the communal, the social space in which we know it works most effectively? And again, we know learning is social from a number of ways, from our own personal experience up through the findings of cognitive and educational psychologists. But I think it is worth emphasizing a couple of the ways that help us articulate why effective and meaningful learning depends upon presence and sociality with one another. So two key concepts articulated by the Soviet psychologist Lev Vygotsky, I think help us, if you're not familiar with them, give us some language to talk about this sociality. So one of them is what Vygotsky called inner speech, right? And learning occurs, he says, not when a particular learner encounters material and sort of has that inner monologue going. Like if you're reading and you're processing that in your head, that's one thing, right? But the real learning occurs when you have to render that inner speech to an external audience. So when I have to take something that's contextualized just to me and now put it out in the broader context, that act of cognition, of translation, and then Vygotsky points out of reflecting on how that process went. Metacognitive thinking, right? How do I do this better next time? That's where learning occurs. So the inner voice to the outer context. And this is a little bit more famous of a concept that you might have heard of, even if you're not an avid Vygotsky groupie. But Vygotsky talks about the zone of proximal development, or ZPD. And basically the way he conceives of it is, on my own, as an individual, I can get up to a certain level in studying or trying to master a new concept or application or set of materials. But if I'm with peers or instructors who are even more knowledgeable or further down the road than I am, I don't stop here. I can get up to here, right? And in that middle ground, that's the zone of proximal development. So what can I do of and by my own faculties? And what can I accomplish in that social setting with peers and instructors who are helping me on that journey? And then, that level becomes the new baseline and your zone of proximal development is. So this is a cycle, right? Vygotsky talks about this is how learning works. It only works meaningfully and effectively if we're able to utilize not just individual, but the proximal development. That is in community near others. Truly meaningful learning is social and it is collaborative. One could make the case and only overstate it slightly that anything short of that is simply memorizing. And so what did we learn during the pandemic that helps us maybe deploy these insights a little more effectively and a little more intentionally in our classes? So one thing that was very helpful, I think, to a lot of instructors during COVID pandemic pedagogy was this model of online instruction, the community of inquiry model. And experienced online instructors will recognize this. But basically what this model does or is aimed at is trying to answer the question, can you actually have a genuine community of inquiry, even if it's a fully remote, fully asynchronous class? And the answer is, well, yeah, you can. It's also really hard. And here's what you need to do in order to cultivate it. And so this model talks a lot about fostering presence, instructor presence, cognitive presence, and most essentially, social presence. What I'm intrigued by are the ways in which these scholars of online teaching and learning have talked about creating a meaningful social presence. That is the degree to which someone in a teaching and learning space can answer the question, am I seeing others and being seen as the full and complicated human being that I am? Because without that, we can't have any of the good stuff Vygotsky talks about, right? One of the things that intrigues me, though, is this doesn't seem like it's simply restricted to a fully online environment. The communications theorists have been talking about social presence for decades, right? And so in a group situation, in a situation that depends upon sociality and presence to be effective, how do we foster that? And Amy Whiteside and her colleagues down in Florida have theorized social presence, I think, pretty effectively and have found the intersection of sort of 5 relatively discrete elements, all of them needing to be present in order for this meaningful social presence to be fostered. And some of these you look at and you're like, well, that's not much of a surprise, right? It affirms a lot of what we know as educators about things that work and things that maybe don't. But one of the things that I always like to highlight when I look at this is interaction intensity. To what degree are these interactions that are happening in this teaching and learning space requiring an investment of effort and energy? So how many of you taught online during pandemic pedagogy? How many of you tried to use discussions? For how many of you were those awful? Right? And the reason that they were awful, and I'm implicating myself in this too, is first of all, the spaces and learning management systems that we ask students to do discussions in don't really look like spaces that they write in any other context. But the second is that these were not sort of very intense interactions. Respond to the prompt by midnight on Friday and respond to 2 of your classmates, right? And so what happens at 11:58 on Friday? There's a whole flurry of responses and then a whole flurry of sort of pro forma agreements. Yeah, thumbs up emoji, I agree. And that was it. And so everybody checked the box, right? And it was done. But what was actually learned? What was expended? What kind of effort did it take? And not in the effort for effort's sake, like performative hard ass kind of stuff, but in the meaningful effort that we know underscores learning in a genuine sense. And so interaction intensity, what are we asking of both ourselves and our students? And in that context, how do we foster social presence? The second element that I'd like to challenge us to think more intentionally about, again, another word that's been kind of floating around the higher education discourse, perhaps maybe not as critically interrogated as we might want, but one that's there that I think we need to really be paying attention to, and that is students' sense of belonging. It's hard to be present if you don't feel like you actually belong in the space in which your presence is being invited, right? And so how do our students, how do they know they belong? And so think here on this campus context, how do your students know that they belong here? Have you told them? Like literally, you belong here? A lot of times people will answer this question, well, we have a welcome week, right? You have the move-in day and the welcome week, there's cookouts, there's flyers. Do you guys do that here? Yeah, I mean, those are cool, and I'm not like arguing against the importance of welcome week, but what happens in week 2? Are they still welcome? Do they still belong? And I think one of the things that we struggle with as institutions is there's not enough adequate communication and collaboration between academic affairs and student affairs. And so student affairs will say, we've created a really welcoming climate. And then academic affairs will come in and say, okay, classes start, time to drop the hammer. And all of a sudden, all that welcoming work is undone. What happens when a student hits academic adversity? What happens when that student who says, well, I'm an A student because I have a 4.0 from high school, gets that first grade that's not an A? And their entire sense of academic self is called into question. Do they feel that they belong then? One of the, I think, the most compelling pieces written about this idea of a sense of belonging and the stakes that are involved in it for students comes from Walton and Cohen's work on a phenomenon that they call belonging uncertainty. So have you ever heard of imposter syndrome? If you went to graduate school, you're well familiar with imposter syndrome because that's what grad school does, right? But in a similar way, Walton and Cohen articulate this idea of belonging uncertainty in that sort of vague, maybe never quite explicit sense that I am not supposed to be here, right? And so in this sense, students come to us, and it's not exclusively first-year students, it is often first-year students. It is not exclusively minoritized or first-gen students, but it is often students from those communities that do feel the impact of this a little more firmly. But our students come to us with a working hypothesis already in place. And that hypothesis is people like me do not belong here. And of course, the psychologists will tell us that if we are in a space where we have a working hypothesis of how it works, we're going to be really attuned to the evidence that supports that hypothesis, right? Confirmation bias is a thing. And this is the problem. Our students usually find evidence that they're looking for. They are told, sometimes explicitly, more often implicitly, that they are correct. This is true. You are not supposed to be in this space. So when that sense of belonging gets attenuated, when it gets stretched almost or perhaps past the breaking point, what happens? Well, Walton and Cohen found that it only takes once, if it's a significant enough challenge to a sense of belonging, it only takes once for that student to never be able to recover that sense of connection to a campus, to an academic culture. Not always, but enough that I think it should concern us. So think of your students and their connections to campus. Imagine those connections as literal physical things. So like the center of campus here, and there's ropes that are radiating outwards, and your students are holding on to ropes. And the more ropes they're holding on to, the more connections they have. And the thicker those ropes are, the stronger those connections have. And so if you have a student athlete who came here to play a sport, That connection is probably a pretty thick rope, right? Connection to the team, a sense of purpose with the sport. Maybe they have aspirations on going professional. From what I hear, y'all do athletics here at that kind of level, right? And so there's this really kind of strong connection. But what happens if that student gets hurt and isn't playing? What other ropes are they holding on to? And if there aren't any, what happens? Right? And so how are students being connected? Connecting themselves? How do they feel a sense of belonging where there is incentive rather than obstacles to forging those strong connections? And of course, one of the things that gets in the way of that happening are the sorts of barriers, for lack of a better term, that we are often implicitly putting in the way of students. If you're familiar with the phrase, the hidden curriculum, right? What are students learning? What are we teaching them over, above, through the formal curriculum? So it's one thing to look at the learning outcomes on the syllabus and say the formal curriculum means I'm going to get A, B, C, and D from this class. But we also know from some research, for example, that discussion-oriented classes, no matter who the instructor is, whatever identity they present as, in discussion classes, there tends to be a bias towards male students as opposed to female presenting students. And that oftentimes not only do male students get called on more, even if there are fewer male students, but also that male students interrupt more and don't get called out on that interrupting. I see a lot of nodding heads because this happens in places like faculty meetings too. What's the hidden curriculum in that class if you're a student who presents as female? What are you learning? Because it might not be the content. It might be whose voice gets heard and whose doesn't. Who gets to interrupt and who doesn't? Whose ideas are worth considering in the public space in our classrooms and whose aren't? Does that student feel that they belong? That is a space for them? Do our students see themselves in this enterprise of knowledge production? We tell our students, at least I hope we're telling our students, that you too could participate in knowledge construction, that we don't want you to just passively receive knowledge, that you are involved in the scholarly work of creating new knowledge, that this is not only possible, but desirable for you to do. And so if I tell my students, we're not just going to learn history, we're going to do history. And then I present a list of course materials of articles and books written by people who look like me. How's that going to land with the people in my class who do not look like me, right? And so you can enter any academic discipline. I spun the wheel last week when I was updating the slide and came up with philosophy. But if you do a Google image search for professors of various fields, or even just professor, you sense a theme. In case you didn't. Now, our Google search results scientifically validated? No, this is what we would call anecdotal data if you're in the quantitative stuff. But I do think it says something powerful about the way that we, broadly speaking, conceive of professorial roles, of knowledge creation, and of who gets to do this, who gets to be in those spaces. And this is one of the key questions that we need to be providing better answers for all across higher education. Who gets to create knowledge and whose voices get to be heard in our fields? And so think about your own particular field of study, your own particular disciplinary niche, wherever it is you sit in your discipline, whatever subfield that might be. And think about where's the really cool work happening right now? Where's the stuff that's generating the buzz, getting published in all the cool kid journals? Where's the stuff that's setting the agenda for disciplinary conversations? Where's the stuff that a whole bunch of panels at next year's professional meeting are going to be about this stuff, right? Who's producing that stuff? Who are they? Where are they? If I were to look at the syllabus for a 100-level class in your discipline that you're teaching maybe, and look at your reading list as who's creating knowledge in this discipline, would my answer from the syllabus match your answer just now in that thought experiment? And if not, what do we do about that? Felicia Rose Chavez wrote a really provocative and powerful book called The Anti-Racist Writing Workshop. And the first time I read it, I came across this quote which really just literally stopped me in my tracks, right? And Chavez talks about being a poor Latino first-gen student from the Rio Grande Valley in Texas, experiencing her first literature course in college. And this is the field into which she is now a professor, right? So this is where she ended up finding her vocation. But that first experience of the reading list, it's startling as a young person of color to stare down the spines of literacy and note the neat annihilation of most of the world. For how many of our students are the spines of literacy, the spines of the important literature and history, the spines of knowledge represented by the textbooks that they encounter, the spines of knowledge by who's in the case studies or the videos or media that help them access the latest disciplinary content? For how many of our students is most of their world neatly annihilated just in the selection of course materials? Students have to feel that they matter. And this is no great novel insight. Everybody needs to feel that they matter. We need to feel that we matter because mattering is motivation. And so thinking about this idea of presence then, what does that mean for us trying to foster presence? Presence has to be more than just the token physical presence or face on a Zoom screen, right? Mattering is what undergirds a strong sense of presence and connection. So students want to feel, as one survey of first-year students found, that they see themselves as valuable, this valued involvement, right? Not just a college's token commitment to diversity, for example, but meaningful actions. If anybody's ever been in the admissions world, there's the phrase in the field, 3 in a tree. 3 students in a tree in the photograph, and it goes on the view book and the pamphlets, and all of those students are from different ethnic backgrounds. And you say, my institution is diverse. Are you supporting those students? Or are you just putting darker faces on your admissions materials? Valued involvement. Functional peer relationships. In other words, not just the proverbial fair weather friend, but relationships that help students when they encounter that first burst of academic adversity. And probably the most important for our purposes in this room today, the belief that faculty are compassionate and that students are more than just another face in the crowd. How do we develop those things from the jump? And how do we sustain those things intentionally and purposefully? If we employ pedagogical tools that foster relationships with trust with our students, we're able to do the things like challenging them, pushing past prior knowledge, getting them to question the sort of received assumptions that they came onto campus with, being able to empathize or describe objectively the viewpoint of someone from a far different cultural context than their own. We can't do any of that stuff if our students don't trust us, because it asks them to take a risk. And students will not take a risk for someone they do not trust. But it enables us to put these challenges into place and to have students learn more meaningfully from them if there is that trust there. So in that same study of belonging and belonging uncertainty, Walton and Cohen also found that a key determinant for students coming up against tough feedback, in other words, not like, oh, I got a B on the quiz, but like this paper would be great if it was completely different. Like that kind of feedback, the student has a choice. They can shut down or they can learn from that feedback. And students who had relationships of trust with a mentor, with an academic figure, with that faculty member, were much better able to act on that feedback for learning. And so for those of us who talk about we want to challenge our students, we want to restore standards, even the dreaded word rigor, you can't do any of that stuff if you are not cultivating a space of presence and trust. Because the simple truth is, and again, this sounds like a truism, but it is worth emphasizing, keeping learners at the center means not undertaking practices that push them to the margins or off the edge of the table entirely. So, that seems like a lot. And it looks a little overwhelming. I am just one instructor in a large state university system facing all of this. Where do I start? What do I do? Change is made in higher education. The old joke that I like to use is that change in higher ed is like trying to parallel park a battleship, right? Like it will eventually happen, but it is slow, unwieldy, and will cause lots of damage in the process. But in all seriousness, thinking about change in higher education, meaningful change, student by student, class by class, term by term, program by program, institution by institution. We don't do it alone. This is work that is done in solidarity, in community with one another. We sustain each other. Hope is a discipline, right? But it's a discipline that has to be practiced collectively. Practiced individually, we burn ourselves out. As the saying goes, an empty vessel can't pour anything for anyone. We also need to realize the revolutionary power of just saying no. Right? As Gil Scott Heron put it, the first revolution is when you change your mind. And so just as Gramsci said that the crisis exists in the old world dying and the new world being, yet to be born, if the status quo is unsustainable, we don't have to accept it. If business as usual is not working for you or your students, there are ways, and what those ways are may vary dramatically depending upon your position and intersection with the institution, but there are ways of saying no. The very act of creating a space of inclusion and compassion in higher education can be revolutionary. It can be emancipatory in the literal sense of the term. It can restore rather than threaten humanity. And we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that all of us have the agency to do that. Again, to use Freire's words, and I like when I think about hope, I like to at the end sort of return back to Freire's observations because I find his work to be very generative and sustaining in that regard. And Freire points out, we didn't get here by accident, right? Social reality, objective social reality, as Freire terms it, is the product of human action. And so it can be changed. What is decided could be undecided, right? The first revolution is when you change your mind. It is not transformed by default, however. Systems of inequality always reproduce themselves generation after generation unless someone actively intervenes to stop that process of reproduction. The default process is more of the same, if not heavier, if not worse. And so how do we intervene? How do we transform? Student by student, class by class, program by program, school by school. Think of your agency. Choose your pathways. And with those in mind intentionally, you can act from an ethic of hope that is not only meaningful, but will sustain you and your community of practice in the work that is to come. So thank you for letting me come and spend some time with you this afternoon. I'm very appreciative to be here, honored to be a part of the symposium, and keep hope alive.